Greetings. My name is Doreen, and I'm sorry that I can't be with you live. At this time, I am traveling in Europe, so I have had to prepare a PowerPoint recording for you to review. Hopefully, if you have questions or comments, you will contact me by email, and then we can have a real conversation about this topic, a topic that I'm quite passionate about. Today, I'm talking about building listening proficiency and extensive listening and listening fluency activities. Let's get started. What do we know about listening? Well, here are a few facts. We listen twice as much as we speak, 4 times as much as we read, and 5 times as much as we write. So it's not something that we can ignore in our language curriculum. It's a complex, active process of receiving, constructing, negotiating, and creating meaning. And it requires on-the-spot processing, since we can't really control the speed of the speech stream coming at us. For the L2 listener, we have to add in the need to rapidly recognize and process L2 sounds and vocabulary, and to make appropriate interpretations of speaker uses of intonation and stress, while trying to reference stored information without full understanding of the cultural context. Simply sending our learners out into the world, real or virtual, to listen is a daunting task and often a failure. How has language teaching responded to this challenge? Well, in my 40 years of teaching and directing language programs, and having observed hundreds of classes, I can say that classroom listening activity tends to focus on comprehension testing. In other words, listen, answer questions, listen, answer questions, which might tell us something about listening abilities, but it may be telling us more about memory and attention. To mitigate this problem, teaching listening strategies has been a fairly regular component of the listening curriculum in the past few decades, and you can also find attention given to listening discrimination tasks like interpreting reductions and contractions in real speech. What you seldom find, though, is listening as the primary means of meaningful input or activity related to listening fluency development. Clearly, there's a problem. Real-life listening is often far beyond the proficiency level of many language learners, and their lack of success is demotivating. Nobody wants to try to put themselves into a conversation with speakers of the target language when you already know that you'll hardly understand what's going on. Research tells us that things like strategy training may be beneficial in some contexts, but learners fundamentally need many more opportunities to listen to accessible, meaning-oriented texts to build both bottom-up and top-down listening processes to establish proficiency. The goal of fluency in L2 listening is the ability to deal with long stretches of speech in a wide range of discourse situations. And one only gets there with sufficient practice. This ability, though, to comprehend utterances effortlessly and rapidly, which should result in comprehending the meaning intended by the speaker, doesn't happen automatically simply because we have listened to anything a certain amount. It has to be accessible. And for most learners, what comes in our textbooks, which may be, considered level appropriate on some general basis of proficiency, is often at that edge of accessibility that causes it to be quite a strain, and not, you might say, a source of a volume of, language that is understood that can be building up not only our implicit learning, but our tolerance and our confidence in being in listening environments. This model by Ankar and Vevo in from 2020, we can see the way they have created this sort of interactive model of these three levels of processing. But within these three, there is a hierarchy, which begins with the initial discrimination of phonemes, segmentation of the speech stream, rapid recognition of word meanings, and then syntactic parsing. Unless one achieves automaticity with these bottom-up processes, there will be little working memory available to understand intended meanings and make connections with prior knowledge and the cultural context. In other words, the well-balanced listening curriculum must attend to building fluency in bottom-up processing, as well as providing accessible listening texts that can provide meaningful input and build fluency in top-down processing. Except for the absolute beginner, who may need to spend more time on bottom-up processing, most learners can benefit from extensive listening and from listening fluency activities, both for meaning-focused input and fluency development. Let's look at the first component, extensive listening. Like extensive reading, extensive listening means engaging with large amounts of accessible text, which can be understood easily with high levels of comprehension. Because the texts are easy, listening is natural, and learners do it for all the same reasons they listen in their primary language. And as with natural listening, you will not get a list of questions or comprehension tasks at the end. And now, how easy do these texts need to be for easy listening? Super easy. In fact, sometimes we think about extensive reading as the opposite of what Krashen suggested as a metaphor for comprehensible input. He said, I+1. Well, that would be for working intensively on language. For extensive learning, listening or reading, it should be I-1. Listening, however, probably needs to be I-2, 3, or maybe even 4. And that's because of the nature of how listening input comes to us. Extensive listening is not listening for specific information. It's not listening for exact words or phrases. It's not listening for details or trying to answer predetermined questions. Those are activities related to intensive listening. EL is not intensive listening. Bamford and Day created this chart initially to explain the differences between intensive and extensive reading, and I've simply used most of the same characteristics to describe the difference between intensive and extensive listening. Intensive listening might work I+1, but extensive listening will absolutely not work with texts of that nature. Extensive listening is different from ER in a number of ways, though. And the main one is that it's constrained by time. In a reading text, you can stop, you can look back, you can reread, you can apply compensatory strategies to try to figure out the meaning or what the proposition might be suggesting. But with listening, you can't really do that because the speech stream is continuous. We seldom have any control over how that text comes to us. EL often involves a learner and a speaker, and then it's complicated by all the varieties of speech that speakers might use. Even if they're speaking the same language, there are individual variations, dialectal variations. Most preview strategies that we use for reading are not available for listening. You can't just stop and look up words. In fact, sometimes mentally people do this, but then they've lost the conversation and they can't pick up. We also find that unlike in a written text where the words are written on the page, they're not moving around, they don't show us stress, intonation, pitch, and volume, except maybe through punctuation and bold. But human voices can do a great deal of variation very suddenly, and that also has to be understood. A much higher proficiency is necessary for effective eval. So if we want to include extensive listening as early as possible, we have to have very, very easy listening texts. So is it really possible to do EL with everyone? Well, these comments here are really based on my experience, and I have not found it actually possible for true beginners, although I seldom get a true beginner anymore, teaching in the United States as I do. But once they get to high beginning, low intermediate, I believe it is possible, although it's very important for the instructor to curate and develop materials that will be accessible and to provide, you might say, kind of guidelines for how to engage in this activity. Otherwise, students are, feel quite demoralized and do not want to participate. For advanced learners, it's fantastic. It's easier to find texts that are easy enough and accessible, and it's a major source of meaningful input. Now, like extensive reading, there should be self-selection going on in extensive listening. And again, if we can find sometimes websites or sets of materials or even produce sets of materials, we can guarantee that there's some variety there, that students may choose what they want to listen to, what they're interested in. And then at different levels, you might say, of accessibility. EL is beneficial for language learning in general, although there isn't as much research on EL as there is on ER. But of course, it is theoretically supported in many ways, right? It's a lot of meaningful input. Most of what we learn in language is really through implicit means, and we couldn't begin to provide enough input in the few hours, of course, of classwork that we have with our students. So creating avenues by which they can get more meaningful input when they're out of class, or even larger volumes of language when they're in class is really critical. So finding accessible listening texts is, I would say, the major issue in implementing extensive listening. And after setting up an EL program for the first time, more than 20 years ago, we other instructors and I developed sort of a set of guidelines that help us and may help you when you're considering developing or curating a library of materials. Here are 5 things that we thought were important to engage in setting up an EL component of the curriculum. We started with recording graded readers. We got different speakers to read them at different speeds. We may have started with very low-level readers, and even those read slowly, but as naturally as possible. Later, of course, we had many of the same readers came with CDs. But remember, what a student is able to read is often much more difficult than that same text in a listening mode. So we didn't find that necessarily having them, side by side or next to each other was the best strategy for extensive listening. We tended then to move mostly online anyway, and this was prior to the pandemic. So we started looking for a range of English language materials online. Most of them natural materials, some of them created by language learners, but some of them very purposefully for language learners. But we still needed to, you might say, evaluate them to see whether they would fit the purposes of extensive listening. We came up with a kind of a grid here, a rubric, really, to get basic information. So criteria like who was it made for? Is it monologue? Is it dialogue? Is it scripted? Is it something being read aloud, or is it very spontaneous? What accent is it? Is it fiction? Is it nonfiction? So we gathered a lot of information about different sites that provided potential materials that we could include in our library. Now, we didn't end up, choosing all of them. And I've only given you a few here that we have used, but you'll notice in the second table, we actually then looked at individual sites a little more closely to try to get at, you might say, more of the leveling information that was necessary. Level of vocabulary, how frequent is the vocabulary on the frequency lists? How much, recycling of vocabulary is there? Is it way too long? Are there copyright issues? Is it easy to use digitally? Can students control the speed? Are there any mechanisms within the website that they could actually slow things down or speed them up? The quality, the visuals, all of it helped us to make decisions on what to include in our library. And you'll notice here that in the comments, we only had a few comments here, but early on, when we had these kind of descriptions of different websites, we could also solicit comments from students who then went on to use them, that they could add comments here to, you might say, help review the sites to improve, basically the information we had and future teachers had, students had in making decisions on what to listen to. Then you have to organize them. Simply opening up the web to students is a bit of a nightmare. They'll spend a lot of time clicking here and there and end up listening to nothing, but just clicking around to see what's available. Plus, they may actually quickly find their way to what they prefer, like movies or sitcoms. And while I'm not saying anything against those things and encourage people to listen to all manner of text when they're on their own out of class, I have a specific sort of agenda here that this has to be a lot of very accessible text so that they actually take in a volume of language, not bits and pieces, and mostly supported by visuals. Although I'm not saying visuals are allowed, but watching a nature movie, where half the time we just hear the animals or watch them is really not the thing that I want students to be doing during their extensive listening time. So we use our learning management system. Currently, I'm using Canvas, and I organize then the websites that I want students to use for extensive listening. And I try to organize them in what I perceive to be, and what students have told me, kind of reflects an order of difficulty level. And I don't open all of them up at the beginning of the semester. I pretty much force everybody in the class to work with 4 or 5 sites for a week or two to sort of judge for themselves. And we talk about it a lot, and we discuss what makes it accessible to you or not, or how did that feel, what percent do you think you understood, that kind of thing, before I open up more sites and let people move on. I mean, in any class, regardless of how they were placed into a group together, their individual skills are not exactly at the same level. And so there's always a range of listening proficiencies in one group. So I have some students who spend a lot of time on very short dialogues between international students on ELLO or ER Central. And I have others who move quite quickly to biography and TED Talks. And so, I mean, that just varies. I just want to make sure that at the beginning of the semester, when we're training students in the concept of EL and what it's meant for, that they should not be struggling through a TED Talk, even if they think the topic is something they're really interested in or relates to another class they're taking. I want them to get volume of language into their brains so that it benefits them for implicit learning and just for listening fluency. Then I think it's really important also that you prepare some kind of online listening log for the students. This kind of activity, it's not about grading comprehension tests. In my system, the grade comes more from the degree to which they actively participate and demonstrate that they are making an effort to, you might say, increase slowly over time the difficulty level and the types of things they're listening to, with while maintaining sort of an equal level of comprehension. The statement on the right-hand side of the screen there is basically a single sentence kind of response that shows me that they've actually listened to it to some degree. So you can see here, there's the date, there's the site that they went to, there's the title of the site, and then there's how many minutes they listened on that site to that particular text, and then they judge for themselves, was that easy or so-so, and you can, or good. And you can see there that the student is mostly doing easy, and then tries something a little harder, and then goes back to something easy, and eventually moves on through the semester to other websites in this way. Now, I prepare these on Google Docs and link them to the learning management system so that I can look at them at any time. This actually works in a way to also judge whether students are trying to game the system by madly putting in a lot of citations of listening after after or near a due date. I watch this quite regularly and keep track of what students are submitting. So here we come then to the second part of the talk, which contributes to a balanced learning curriculum. By including extensive listening in your curriculum, you will have gone a long way to implementing a balanced language curriculum, according to Paul Nation, who contends that there should be 25% meaning-focused input, 25% meaning-focused output, 25% form-focused learning, and 25% fluency development. Now, what we know is that a lot of what actually happens in the classroom is form-focused learning. So if you can add extensive listening in as a significant component into your course, you've gone a long way to shifting the focus to meaning. If you add fluency building activities, you will have gone a long way to building this part of the curriculum. Those two together can take the focus off of form or language focused learning. You want an equal distribution if possible. Nation and Waring, in their 2020 book on fluency development, this was particularly about extensive reading, but they're looking here more broadly at a curriculum that would be balanced. And you'll notice that, in fact, we've got language-focused learning. This is the stuff we are quite familiar with. But the other big category is meaning-focused input. And here, they have extensive reading and extensive listening. Now, if it's a listening curriculum, then it would just be extensive listening in this category and conversation. Further, if you look in fluency development, it doesn't list extensive listening. It doesn't list extensive reading. It's not about language tasks in the book, right? It's not conversation or presentations. It's very different. Well, it is spontaneous speeches or conversations, but that's not the same as a planned or prepared speech. These are all activities addressing all the skills here that help to build fluency. And you might do some of these that benefit one skill or another. But my question is, how much listening fluency building is in your curriculum? In this list here, there's only one item called quick listening. Again, let me repeat, at every stage of development, learners should be fluent with what language they can produce spontaneously. And that would apply to what they can comprehend spontaneously. The product of listening is comprehension. Now, we do have some criteria for fluency building activities, and focus on meaning is no different than meaning focused learning. Using familiar content. Well, that of course makes things more accessible, right? We don't have to struggle as much. We don't need as much top-down processing to try to figure out the context or, prior knowledge, background knowledge to connect to it. So we're thinking about meaning, not testing, just meaning, comprehension with something familiar. And then we have two features which we don't often find in the language curriculum, and that is time constraints and repetition or practice. We're not talking here about a return to audiolingual pattern practicing and rote memorization kind of repetition. We're talking here about multiple opportunities to process language in similar ways, in small chunks, added into the curriculum to support the development of the automaticity of the bottom-up processes. So here is a list of 8 different fluency building activities, and we don't have time to go over all of them. I will introduce you to 4 of them, but they all have references here, and they're all in the reference list at the end of this presentation, and so you can look them up and find out more about them. But let's just go to the first one then. The first one is repeated listening, and this is very basic, but really important. In fact, as I've been traveling in Europe, in countries where I have, a small amount of proficiency, I realize, for example, remembering how to process the numbers quickly has kind of faded in my mind, and I actually needed some of this kind of repeated listening practice. But this is very good for beginning levels. You can do numbers, you can do words, you can do phrases. Of course, you can make it more difficult for higher proficiency, but it works really well in the early stages of language learning to do this kind of boot camp practice. And all of these activities, we do have to explain to students why we're doing them. We're not just filling time. I mean, these are research-based practices to build their proficiency, and they support implicit learning, and we're not going to test them. And at first, they kind of don't believe it, but they get used to it, and actually, it contributes to their engagement because they're not afraid of making mistakes. They're just trying to better themselves. And so if there's any competition, it's competition with self. This is what I could do last time. I see if I can do a little better this time. So in this particular example, you prepare texts very, very easily, and then you get yourself or your friends to do recordings of a sort of a random or an ordering of a set of words. And then the students have a worksheet or a piece of paper while they're listening, and they try to note or write down what they hear in a particular, in the order that it comes. And of course, we can start slower and then make it faster and faster and faster. And the note here about Audacity, it's a great free software for editing audio files, and you can speed up and slow down very quickly any particular audio file. Let's just show you an example here. Okay, so you can see that here, let's say the students have a worksheet. So they're going to work on numbers 1 through 10. Okay, so it's very, very beginning, but they have to learn to discriminate these quickly, especially when they go to the store, right? Or they're trying to get a phone number or whatever it is. They have to articulate them quickly. So they could either listen and just point, or if you want to have them check with each other and see how they're doing, you could also have them write down the numbers. So here's the recording.
3, 8, 1, 10, 3, 7, 4, 9, 6, 2, 10, 4, 7, 2, 8, 1.
Okay, so I could have been writing those down here, and then I could, share my list of numbers with my neighbor and see if I heard them all. Maybe it's too fast, maybe it's too slow. If everybody got them right, well, we could speed up the tape and try that. Notice though, as we go through other groups of numbers, you might get to the random ones like 1330, 1440, 1550, 1660, and these are often difficult to discriminate. Even highly proficient speakers of the language sometimes have to double check. Of course, in running speech, there are other problems which emerge with these numbers. But if we cannot, you might say, parse that speech stream, if we can't segment these particular chunks of sound, it makes it much harder than when it's in running speech. So that's why this is a fluency building activity. And you only do it for short periods of time, but repeatedly over time so that it builds up capacity. Another one is quick listening. So quick listening is, a guided kind of listening. Again, we can notice that I have a picture here of what it looks like if I have the same text at 3 different speeds on my learning management system. And mine is like 50% means half the normal rate, and 75% means just a quarter less than the normal rate. So this is the normal rate at 100. This is the slowest rate. And they might want to start here. In some cases, if you go down to 50, there is some distortion in the sound, but the key is not to change speed or pitch, but to change tempo. And that keeps speed and pitch together generally. We'll take a look at this in a second. So what's different here is that you actually have a text, it, and you prepare kind of a close text that they can fill in as they're listening. But it's not the whole text. It's just some items in the text. So they have to be listening in the text for when something shows up on their paper and then fill it in. It also comes with yes, no, or true, false statements that may occur in the text. So it's kind of a careful listening, which is why it may have to start slow, but it helps them. It gives them a visual support for what they're hearing. Let's take a look at this. Okay, so here's a prompt for a short text. And I'm going to just play a bit of it. I'm not going to play all of it. But if you had this text in front of you with your pen, you would be filling in when you notice that you've gotten to a place like this. And so these words are all in the text. This is just not all of the text. So it's not a true close.
Oceans. The water in the oceans is salt water, not fresh water. Almost 75% of Earth is covered by oceans. Ocean ecosystems are very important because ocean plants make about 50% of the world's oxygen. At the coast. The coast is the area of land next to an ocean. At the coast, water moves onto a beach and covers it for part of the day, and then it goes out again because of the tides. Many food chains at the coast start with seaweed that grows on rocks. Like most plants, seaweed uses light to make its food. Small animals that eat seaweed have shells that protect them from predators, sun, and wind when the tide is out. Animals like crabs and birds eat these small shellfish. Plants.
Okay, we can stop there. You get the idea. So, excuse me, they are listening for when there are similar words, and then they fill in or answer a question, true or false. Of course, they might not get all of it at first. It may be too fast. They may not know how to do it. They do it a few times, maybe the first time, but then you put it away and you might bring it out a week later. Or you finish it at one speed and then the week later you bring it out at a faster speed. Of course, you want to have multiple texts like this. So it could be, a 5-minute activity every day but you're alternating texts so that they're not repeating it too many times in a row. Okay, that keeps the meaning interesting. It allows them to build capacity across different content and then try it at a higher rate later on. A third activity is reading while listening. Well, we know in general this can be facilitative, and there's some research on extensive reading, for example, that suggests that this listening while reading can be facilitative of improving reading comprehension and reading rate. But here we are really trying to work on the listening side of it. So this is basic, and we're trying to do it as a building, a fluency building task. So we're not doing whole texts, we're not doing long texts, we're not doing it, as part of their extensive listening. These are short bursts of listening to text, maybe at a slow speed to start with and building up, but just listening and reading the transcript at the same time. Again, do it a few times, put it away, bring it out again a few days later, and see if they can do it more quickly. And ultimately, sometime later, they might bring it out without the text at all, just listening, and have the knowledge refreshed and another sort of opportunity for implicit learning. And it doesn't feel like boring repetition because it's been spaced with many other activities. So here we have an example, and here I just show you quickly what it means when I use 3 different speeds. So the first one is 50% slower than the original, and it is a little distorted in from this particular recording. It doesn't always happen this way.
This is 6 Minutes English from bbclearningenglish.com.
Hello, I'm Rob. Welcome to 6 Minute English.
I assure you that isn't how the 50% sounds all the time, but from that particular audio file, it didn't come out very well. But notice the difference here when we go to 25.
This is 6 Minutes English from bbclearningenglish.com.
Hello, I'm Rob. Welcome to 6 Minute English. I'm joined today by Neil. Hi, Neil.
Hi there, Rob.
Today we're talking about something many of...
All right, and then here is the 100%. This is
6 Minutes English from bbclearningenglish.com.
Hello, I'm Rob. Welcome to 6 Minute English. I'm joined today by Neil. Hi, Neil.
Hi there, Rob.
Today we're talking about something many of us are familiar with, drinking in a bar or a pub. Now, Neil, do you have a favourite bar or pub?
All right, well, we won't carry on with that, but in fact, this is a text that students are interested in. I'm working with university students, and of course, learning the vocabulary about bars and pubs and taverns is quite interesting. Now, some of this might not fit into the US context. However, I encourage students to include some BBC 6-minute listening into their fluency building or even their extensive listening, because it is important to listen to varieties of English, not just to one.
This is 6 Minutes English from bbclearningenglish.com.
Hello, I'm Rob.
Sorry about that. I didn't know which one I had turned on.
Oh,
let's go to the last one, narrow listening. Oh, so narrow listening is basically some variation of what we've already been looking at in these other two. However, this time there's no text there's no written text, no transcript, but the topics, there are several recordings all on the same topic. And the students listen to all of the recordings, 5 or 6, produced by different speakers spontaneously. And this again gives people, there's recycling of concepts, of vocabulary, of structures, collocations. They're listening to slightly different variations of speech, men and women. You might find people from other regions of the country to do the recordings for you. And then, of course, it can be culturally interesting content or really necessary content like talking about food or shopping or cooking or pleasure or something else, sports, whatever might be of interest. In fact, you can solicit your students to give you suggestions on topics that they'd like to listen native speakers or culturally proficient individuals talk about. So you ask your friends and colleagues, if they would just simply record, and it's so easy now, you can do it on your phone almost anywhere, and send it to you, that they would just talk spontaneously on a particular topic. So for example, could you talk about travel? And maybe you have to give a little more of a question, talk about where you traveled last summer, or what you find irritating about travel, or what you find the most pleasurable about travel, and then ask several people to do that. And then they've got a little set. And again, they can just speak at their normal pace. You can decide if you want to slow them down. It depends on what the students tell you. They may say, oh, that was way too fast, I can't understand. Okay, so pull those back, go to Audacity. Literally, it takes like a couple of minutes to change the speed of a text and have it ready to go again. So you wouldn't want to spend more than 10 minutes on doing this, and you might repeat the same small set a few times in a week. You might intersperse it with other topics and then come back to them. The goal is, with most of these, you can see that the repetition should not happen all at once. It should be dispersed, and that keeps it interesting, and they can see change occur. We try to do it at different speeds if necessary to see change and progress. And we don't do it for long periods of time, so they don't get restless or bored by the activity. Well, those are just 4 of the 8, and you can look up the other ones and you can collect them. When you start to implement even 1 or 2 of these and think about the principles or the criteria by which you can identify these activities, you can start making them up on your own to help your students out. Let me just close with a few tips. Train the students early in these activities. Like if you're going to use 3 in a semester, train them in all 3. Early in the semester, and then you will not lose time over the semester as you jump, from one activity to another. They'll know what it is. Okay, quick listening, and they'll know to get out this, go to this place on the website or in their learning management system, and it can go much more quickly. Remember, it's always better to do these activities for a short period of time regularly than for a long period occasionally. Always have the students keep track of what they're doing. Maybe this goes along in the extensive listening journal, but they should keep track of what they're doing also to build up their fluency. One, it's a record of effort. It's a demonstration that they're engaging actively in their own language learning. It is recognition that these are practices that they now know and they can continue to do them long after the class is over. Both extensive listening and fluency listening or fluency building activities are very specific methods. So I regularly remind students why we are doing them. Why are we engaging these activities? I'm not just trying to sit around and watch you do stuff. We're doing these things because they are supported by research, supported by language learning theory. Sometimes I even cite the research that supports a particular activity. I want them to know that there's a reason that we're engaging in this and that it will actually help them. If they want to watch movies, that's fine, but they have to do it on their own time, not on class time or homework time. Well, you can see here a few comments from students. I've always found that the students are quite receptive to both extensive listening and fluency building activities. It's a little harder to get extensive listening going than extensive reading for precisely the reasons why EL is different, right? It's harder to find accessible texts, and that just makes it a little more difficult for students. But we can go a long way as instructors to, you might say, curate, guide, and support their choices in this matter. Here are the references for all the various things that I've mentioned in this PowerPoint. And so finally, I'd just like to say thank you again for listening to this recorded talk. And I really, really would love to hear comments, questions, or requests even for more information through email. And you see my address there. If you have any trouble downloading this recorded presentation from the website and you need it, please let me know. I can at least send you a PDF of the PowerPoint, if not of the entire audio report, video report. All right. Thanks again. Bye-bye.